Good evening, everyone. My name is Tracy Glynn, and along with the other Tertulia organizers, Daniel Tubb from the University of New Brunswick, Christy Lane, and Matthew Hayes from St. Thomas University, I welcome you to our event tonight. So for 12 years, I was the forest campaigner at the Conservation Council of New Brunswick, where I got to know Bill and Mark, our speakers tonight. So I'm especially excited for tonight's talk with two engaged scholars on forestry. So before introducing tonight's speakers, Bill Parenteau and Mark McLaughlin, I want to also acknowledge that our event is coming to you today from the unceded territories of the Wolastoqey, the Mi'kmaq, and the Passamaquoddy. These lands are subject to the Peace and Friendship Treaty signed between the Indigenous peoples of the Wabanaki and the British Crown in the 1700s. So when we talk about our forest or the Crown Forest tonight, we should all keep in mind that we're talking about lands never surrendered by the Indigenous peoples of the Wabanaki. I also want to begin this event by paying tribute to a dear elder from Nacowick who we lost a few days ago, Dan Ennis. So Dan was a fierce defender of Indigenous rights and culture who I had the pleasure of meeting several times at talking circles at the 2009 road blockade when Nacowick women and elders stood up to MB Power and the New Brunswick government and took control of their dam over broken promises. And most recently at his house when his partner Caroline Ennis delivered the Tertulia talk on her role in ending gender discrimination in the Indian Act back in March, which you can watch on the MB Media Co-op website at mbmediacoop.org. If you didn't know Dan Ennis, I know some of you tonight did know Dan. In 1996, Dan organized to bring back the Wolastoq Grand Council, which had been the governing body for the Wolastoqey people since before the Europeans arrived on lands now known as Fredericton, the St. John River Valley, Edmundston, northwestern New Brunswick. So Dan served as the chief of the Wolastoqey Traditional Council at Nacowick. Dan spent his life defending Indigenous culture and rights. He spoke out against systemic racism, colonialism, and white supremacy. He worked for the New Brunswick Human Rights Commission, never forgetting that the laws in place were what he called the white man's laws. Along with his co-conspirator, Pat Paul, they produced the Wolastoq Times, a newsletter delivered across the province that included Dan's Corner, a column on his reflections. So Dan successfully brought forward cases to the Human Rights Commission when Indigenous peoples were being denied their rights to housing, people living with disabilities were being denied their rights to housing, people jailed and refused smudging and cultural ceremonies while in prison. So when he made complaints, he made sure that the complaints spoke of the systemic racist nature of the problem at the heart of the complaint. So as we grapple with the discovery of 215 children found buried in unmarked graves, at the Kamloops Residential School, and a provincial government that has so far refused to do an inquiry on systemic racism against Indigenous peoples, as we mark the one-year anniversaries of the police killings of Chantel Moore and Rodney Levi, we should fight like Dan did, never afraid to speak the truths, seek the truth and speak the truth. He made us think, and if you knew Dan, he also made us laugh. So tonight's talk is co-presented by the Tertulias Fredericton, the Conservation Council of New Brunswick, Raven, and the MB Media Co-op. I want to thank Lois Corbett, the Executive Director of the Conservation Council, who had this idea and invited the Tertulias group to partner up on this event tonight. So if this is your first Tertulia, you're probably wondering what the heck a Tertulia is. A Tertulia is a kind of philosophy cafe in the Iberian tradition where folks talk about big thinkers, artists, and ideas. And this past winter and spring, Tertulias Fredericton put together a series on activists and social movements that have shaped our lives and allowed us to imagine a better future. You can stay tuned for our fall lineup and be in touch with one of our organizers if you have an idea of a big thinker, artist to add to our lineup. So tonight's event, Winning the Race to the Bottom, New Brunswick Forestry in Historical Context, is being organized as a standing committee on climate change and environmental stewardship, a committee of New Brunswick MLAs from all parties, some of whom may be present tonight, is set to conduct hearings on the glyphosate spraying of our forests, a widely unpopular practice for its impacts on forest diversity and wildlife, health, and the economy. You'll hear about that at the end of our event when Lois Corbett joins us to talk a little bit about that. So tonight's event is also being organized as Crown timber prices have skyrocketed, but Crown timber royalty rates have not budged, leading many to question again why the province is refusing to demand adequate payment for the extraction of natural resources. And today's event is also being organized as the province of New Brunswick yet again uses the Crown Lands and Forest Act to fine Wolastoqey loggers for harvesting timber illegally. And as treaty scholar Andrew Bear Nicholas reminds us, Indigenous peoples of the Wabanaki over and over again have been forced to go to Canadian courts to uphold the treaties and inherent Aboriginal rights. And Bill Parenteau, one of our speakers tonight, has acted as an expert witness in many of these cases, including this most recent case. So this evening, Bill Parenteau and Mark McLaughlin will explore the past century of developments in Crown Forest management that will help us understand how we got to this place where we clear cut, then spray our forests like it's a garden that we need to eradicate the weeds. But the weeds in this case are the hardwoods like maples, birches, and basswood, and all kinds of forest flora that provide food and medicine for ourselves, and all kinds of forest critters. And the historians will help us understand how we got to this place where woodlot owners who select cut, like my dad, for instance, are unable to compete with forestry companies clear cutting volumes of wood from the Crown Forest. They will help us understand the path that we need to chart if we're seriously going to consider a future for our forests in a time of climate change. So I will now introduce our speakers. So Bill Parenteau is a recently retired professor of history at the University of New Brunswick. His published research is broadly on the political economy and environmental history of Atlantic Canada. Additionally, he is a frequent public commentator on forest industry issues and a participant in Indigenous treaty and land rights cases. One thing you may not know about Bill is that he's a sought after artist in his retirement, working, I think, primarily in clay. Is that right? And other mediums. Mark McLaughlin is assistant professor of history and Canadian studies at the University of Maine, based in Bangor. Dr. McLaughlin's research has focused on forestry and natural resources management, particularly the notions of forests as contested spaces and the state as mediator between various user groups competing for access to public resources. And one thing you may not know about Mark is that he has become an avid disc golf player during COVID. Sorry, I'm just, okay. So covering the different areas of history that they're most familiar with, we'll begin with Bill, and then we'll go to Mark, and then we'll circle back to Bill to bring us to this current period. And then Lois Corbett will join us at the end in a call to action. And then we'll open up our event to questions and discussion, and that period will not be recorded, so you'll feel free to ask your questions, and you can do that in the chat room or on the Facebook Live discussion board that we'll also be monitoring. So now I will turn it over to Bill.
Thank you, Tracy. As Tracy suggested, I'm a recently retired history professor, and I must say I'm very good at being retired. Unlike other things, it's great to get up in the morning and think, wait, what am I going to do today? It's hard to screw that up. This is my first Tertulia, and I got to say, I like the fragrance. So I'm just going to launch right into it. I'm going to outline the period from 1780 to 1940. I'm not going to speak really fast, but I'm going to touch on some of the themes that I think are salient for understanding the foundations of the debates that we're having today. And at the end, after Mark covers the second half of the 20th century, I'll come back and talk a little bit about the 21st century and pick a few selected issues. I'm not going to talk about glycophosphates. I think Lois and Tracy and probably half the audience are more qualified than I am. I can generally fake my way through a lot of things. This is not one of them. So let's just start. The first forest industry in the contact period was the making of shift masts, mainly for the British Navy. It started in earnest in the 1760s. Contracts were let to two firms, Davidson and Simon Hazen and White, who had royal charters to the fisheries and forest resources at the mouth of the St. John and Miramichi River. The reason the masting trade came when it did was the American Revolution. Up until that point, or before that, for a number of years, the British had relied mainly on New Hampshire and the District of Maine, which at the time was part of Massachusetts. For the mass, obviously that was cut off by the Revolution. So they quickly came up to New Brunswick, and New Brunswick became the principal or most important provider of masts and spars for the British Navy. The real height of the masting trade came between 1790 and 1805, when between up to 3,000 masts per year were sold to the British Navy. Um, in some respects, the masting trade was very simple. It was a matter of felling a great white pine tree, cutting the branches off and the top off, and getting it to a body of water that was capable of floating a stick of wood 100 or so feet long and several tons in weight. So from the beginning, the trade was limited in the sense that you had to be pretty close to the river in order to effectively cut and make money off a masts. The other thing is at the time, New Brunswick really had a shortage of labor and especially a shortage of draft animals. It could take up to 6 oxen to haul a stick of wood used for making masts. The waste is a big issue in this industry. When you take the tops off and all the branches, the top gets cut off at 16 inches in diameter, then you're talking about wasting around 50% of the wood. The other thing about the masting trade is not all great white pines, um, uh, of 300 years age or more, were suitable for masts because they were just as likely as not to have heart rot. So basically, they'd cut them, look at the heart of the wood, and if it wasn't sound, then they just leave the whole thing there. So it's a wasteful and by nature migratory industry. Um, once you've cut all the great white pines within 100 meters or so of the body of water that you're floating it in, then it doesn't become then it's not profitable anymore. Um, and that's what happens in New Brunswick. In 1805, the British Navy started making contracts with Quebec producers, and by 1810, essentially, the New Brunswick trade was defunct. Already by 1800, a trade in square timber had developed to replace the masting trade. Um, it was also affected by larger geopolitical forces. Mainly, it was a child of the Napoleonic Wars between Britain and France that began in the early years of the 19th century. The Berlin Decree, Napoleon's Berlin Decree in 1806, closed all French-controlled ports to British trade, and then the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807 cut off the Baltic trade, Russia, Prussia, Sweden, Norway, to a lesser extent, Denmark. And that was the major source. That was a major source of square timber, or the major source of square timber for the square timber trade. Um, so, so that's the catalyst for a major trade in square timber. And it was really spurred forth by a series of tariffs, duties on wood coming from outside the empire. This started in earnest in 1803, and within a 10-year period, the duty on any wood coming from outside the empire was 275% of its value. So what they were really doing is they were making up for the disadvantage that British North America had in terms of transportation. You could make 2 trips to the Baltic in London, say, for every trip you made from New Brunswick or Nova Scotia. So by putting the duties on, they made this region competitive, and they encouraged entrepreneurs to invest in the trade. New Brunswick is often assumed to be a backwater of empire, but it played an important role in these decades with both the shipmasting and square timber trade in terms of maintaining British sea power, which was the foundation of British power and the British colonial project in the world. Square timber could be made of smaller trees and more species, but it was also a very wasteful industry. Making square timber involved cutting a tree that would be, uh, you know, 16 feet long and 12 inches at the top end. The tree was felled, limb, cut off the top, and then it was hewn flat on all four sides by a broadaxe. It was rolled into the water during the spring fresh and brought out to port to be loaded on ships. The squaring of the timber actually, meant you could get more into the hold of a cargo ship. Wastage in this industry was between 25 and 30%. So again, a wasteful industry. But for a period of 20 years, New Brunswick was the most important producer of square timber for the British market. It wasn't until 1836 that Quebec surpassed New Brunswick. You can kind of see a pattern here with these industries where there's kind of an arc. It starts in the St. Croix and St. John, goes through the Miramichi, and then up through the Restigouche, and then down the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So there's an arc to the first phases of forest production in the region. The thing about the trade is that as soon as Napoleonic Wars ended, it became embroiled in the great economic debate in the British Parliament in the first half of the 19th century, which was between the mercantilists and the free traders. The mercantilists argued that people had invested a lot of money in good faith in colonial industries, timber, corn, wheat, things like that. And they were entitled to protection. The free traders, on the other hand, argued that the empire could no longer afford the mercantile system because it was a drag on the British economy. So for many years, starting around 1820, the mercantilists held back the free traders until 1842, when cuts were made in the duties on square timber coming from outside the empire. And this really kind of spelled the end of the square timber trade in the period from 1842, and it was almost completely gone by 1860. But there's another factor involved in it, and that is it's progressively being replaced anyway in that same arc from the St. Croix to the St. John, Miramichi, and Restigouche by a trade in lumber, in sawn lumber. Now, sawn lumber is a much better commodity if you want to build a colonial society than square timber, because there's value added in the manufacturing process. It creates more labor and can be and smaller diameter trees of a wider range of species can be used for sawmill products. So there was a trade that developed with the United States, that was, what do we say here? That was, boosted by American investment in the 1830s, and then the reciprocity treaty between the British and the Americans in the period from 1854 to 1866. However, the foundation of the trade was in spruce and pine deals to the UK. Now, a deal is a plank of wood at least 12 inches long and 2 inches thick, although it can be much thicker and much longer. And essentially, it was a semi-manufactured product. It was sent over to Great Britain and then resawn into building materials in the British ports. The rise of the lumber industry, sometimes called the long lumber industry, also fostered the development of a business class, generally referred to as the lumber lords or lumber barons. These were a group of merchant sawmillers and politicians that dominated commerce in their particular fiefdoms. You know, the big ones, there were big ones in Chatham and Newcastle, St. John, Campbellton, Dalhousie, but also a lot of small outports were dominated by these sawmillers who were also merchants. So they ran the stores, sold goods to the people that worked in their mills and forest operations, and basically operated it very much like the cod fishery in the outports of Newfoundland. The lumber barons became embedded in the political structure of the province, really from 1850 to well into the 20th century, an average of about 50% of members of the Legislative Assembly were directly involved in the lumber trade. So you can see where already by the 1840s and 1850s, this domination of the political landscape of the province by a dominant group of wood product merchants was already kind of taking hold. These were also community leaders who, you know, and patrons in churches, education, healthcare, and other aspects of social development. So they're of a different type than, it's a different model than the corporate model, which would replace it. So you have this group of merchants, and one thing I should stress is this isn't some kind of golden age of a kind of happy sort of relationship between entrepreneurs and communities. These are tightly structured communities, and you know they're also almost all the time include a company store. So you see the kind of debt peonage that's often wrought by this system and is characteristic of both the forest industries and the fisheries of the region. So this is not some sort of a romantic past, although it's sometimes portrayed as such. It's a hard scrabble life, working in the woods and living in rural New Brunswick in the 19th century. The political power of the lumber lords transitioned smoothly into power over forest regulation. It was a political system by lumber barons, of lumber barons, and for lumber barons, particularly as pertained to favorable crown land regulation. To give one example, from 1860, around the date that the lumber barons ascended, to 1893, the duration of tenure on Crown land timber leases was regularly extended. It went from 1 year per lease in 1860 to 25 years per lease in 1893 in a series of political political decisions. Likewise, Crown land timber royalties were kept low and flat. Theoretically, they were designed to be flexible and reflect market conditions. But to give another example, stumpage fees, the royalties, remained at $1.25 per thousand board feet for 30 years from 1883 to 1913. The exception was the period 1890 to 1903, where it was reduced to $1 per 1,000 board feet. So the point I would make is Crown land then, as now, control of Crown lands then is now translated into political power. The domination of leaseholders of forest policies is really not a new phenomenon. It's something certainly that we live with, and some of us live with great pain. But it's not new. The decline of the lumber industry began in the 1880s and was caused largely by resource depletion and secondarily by growing competition from Central Europe. Um, you know, the simple fact was that after decade after decade of cutting meant that you had to go further and further away from the rivers to find merchantable stands of the desired species, and that meant extra costs. So it was another problem, a long-term problem. So the industry, as I was saying, starts to decline in the 1880s, but the real first crisis, which consisted of a wave of bankruptcies, some of them in New Brunswick, came in the early years of the 20th century. Several of the largest firms fell into bankruptcy then. So the lands that were left, the crown land leases that were left dormant as a result of business failures were eagerly snapped up by the emerging pulp and paper industry. What had happened in the United States and to a lesser extent in Ontario and Quebec was that people who built the early, fiber was, wood fiber was not made into paper really in a large scale until the 1880s. But the early mills had under kind of played the amount of wood they would need in the long term. So there was a rush on any wood that was available on the market, and Eastern Canada was a prime target for U.S. mills and to a certain extent Canadian mills to bolster their forest holdings. Now, in this process, New Brunswick was an outlier. Many of the lumberman politicians in New Brunswick, especially on the Miramichi, were suspicious or outright hostile to pulp and paper. Well, for one, few of them had the credit or capital to finance a multi-million-dollar mill. It was also important that merchant sawmills made at least as much money from their company stores and provisioning camps as they did from selling lumber. Thus, there was an incentive to carry on through lean years in the lumber markets because, after probably 1890, just like the fishery again, the sale of consumer goods was as important, if not more important, than the money made from the sale of lumber. Lumber was a reason to keep a store open and keep clients, and usually in debt. So the industry in New Brunswick, the lumber industry, limped along until the First World War, which really stalled the transition to pulp and paper because the war brought with it unprecedented demand and prices for all wood products. So the war years for the New Brunswick forest industries were very good. And there was many of the largest lumber operators overinvested. So when the crash came, when the recession hit in June of 1919, they were unprepared, and all of the largest lumber operators in the province started to fall one by one. The solution for the conservative James Baxter government that was elected in 1925 was to finally facilitate the transition to pulp and paper. The government turned over the lumber leases and the prime hydroelectric site at Grand Falls to the so-called pulp triumvirate. This was International Paper, Fraser Companies, and Bathurst Pulp and Paper, owned by Angus McLean, a major lumber operator who made the transition. He's headquartered in Buffalo. The lumber industry never completely died, but it would never again be the primary motivator for forest industry development. But by the end, and this is important point, I think, by the end of the 1920s, these three companies controlled 70% of the forest lands in New Brunswick, industrial forest lands. That's private and crown land. And they had divided up the major electrical generating capacity. So that was a big, major kind of change and brought with it also, as I'll speak a little bit about, corporate model of resource management, which is different than what previously existed. Crown land leases at this time in 1927 were extended for 25 to 50 years, which is, obviously a long time. Now, the thing about the transition to pulp and paper was that it couldn't have come at a worse time. The market crash in 1929 and the subsequent depression of the 1930s hit pulp and paper just as hard, maybe even harder than any other major industry. Even the new large technically advanced mills in New Brunswick operated at no more than 50% capacity for the entire decade of the 1930s. To make conditions even worse, only 28% of the wood used in pulp mills in the 1930s came from Crown lands, because these are large companies that have significant private and Crown land holdings in a number of jurisdictions. So the New Brunswick, in the Brunswick situation, International Paper and Bathurst Pulp and Paper Company owned large leaseholds in Quebec and the Gaspé region of Quebec and around Lake Temiscouata, in that area, in the north, close to the New Brunswick border. So, so this is the corporate model. I mean, the thing is they want to develop, or they want to, collect as much of the forest resource as possible, because it's impressive to investors and it guarantees the long-term viability of the mill in terms of raw materials. So you've got these large areas of New Brunswick which are lying dormant, and the people in the communities that used to be favored by a sawmill are left out of the process, because it's really a radical change in the industrial geography of the province from sawmilling to pulp and paper. You've got 3 big mills where you may have had a few dozen a decade before. So that's, I think, a key moment. People didn't take too kindly to this new corporate ideology of accumulating and sitting on large areas of forest. By 1932, a broadly based protest movement had coalesced around the issues of cutting wood on Crown land and giving community-based wood processors access. The movement included farm and labor groups, county councils, local entrepreneurs, boards of trade, and other community-based groups. And this is really the genesis of an ideological divide between modern corporate principles and pre-existing notions within New Brunswick communities. The Crown lands should be first and foremost utilized as an engine for economic and social development. I think that's the key point, because that's what we're going to be seeing in another week or so. When they talk about Crown land royalties, that debate could have come straight out of the 1930s. And it's still the same divide. We're all sitting here, and I'm assuming many of the people in the audience are wondering why New Brunswickers do not benefit as much as they should by the Crown Forest. Those feelings were very much palpable in the going back to the 1930s. There's lots more to say about this, and I'm happy to field questions. I'm going to turn it over to Mark now, and he'll be making, I think, some suggestions that this ideological divide exists during the second half of the 20th century. Okay, Mark.
Great, thank you, Bill. Tracy, can you hear me okay? Great, got the thumbs up, wonderful. Thank you everyone for joining us here today. This is great, wonderful to see so many people and not so many people if your screens are turned off, but that's okay. I'm gonna be picking up from where Bill left off in about 1940 And I'm going to be bringing us up into the early 21st century. And then Bill will kind of be wrapping up the last decade or so, 10 or 15 years. And I want to reiterate what Bill was saying in terms of these competing visions of how Crown forests should be managed and used. So there's kind of this sort of corporatist viewpoint, if you will, or corporate approach, and this more sort of community-focused vision, if you will. And these competing visions of how the Crown forest should be managed and used have continued really from the 1930s up until the present day. I guess we might think of it as pulp and paper on one side, and on the other side, a diversity of interests. Number of groups we might think of as forest user groups, other forest users groups. And I want to say that not all of these groups have the exact same sort of approach to how Crown forests should be used and managed. There's lots of different viewpoints and lots of different models out there, perhaps. But they all generally have agreed over the decades and years that Crown forests should be focused on a broader economic and social development of New Brunswick, and not simply catering to the whims of large corporations, if we can use that terminology. And one way in which we might think of the Crown forest during this period of, say, the 1930s and even right up until the present is an academic term that we like to use called contested spaces. And essentially what this means is that it's a long-term contest over decades between competing visions of how the public forests should be used. And as we've heard from Bill, an important factor in all of this is the state or the provincial government, the New Brunswick government. And ideally, the New Brunswick government acts as a sort of mediator between all of these various groups who want to gain access to the Crown forests. So the provincial government mete out different sorts of access. And starting in the 1960s, the New Brunswick government really started launching a whole series of commissions, task forces, and inquiries on forestry in New Brunswick. And they would have heard from industry, these other forest user groups, and even individual citizens. And all of these folks who would have been presenting would have presented their ideas as to how the forestry sector should be structured and how the Crown forest should ideally be managed, depending on their viewpoint. So it's important to point out that there's always been lots of other ideas out there as to how the Crown forests should be managed, how they should be used, how things should be done. Sometimes we might hear the talking point that how forestry in New Brunswick has developed was almost inevitable. I don't know if that's correct. Where we are today emanated from particular decisions that were made in the past. These were in particular decisions that were made by those with political power. So what I want to do here today with my time is sketch out for you, just very broadly, why these certain decisions were made, how they led to the passage of the Crown Lands and Forest Act in a very general way, and why in the 21st century, Crown forest management in New Brunswick appears to be solely for the benefit of a few large companies and not necessarily the many. So one of the defining characteristics of forestry in New Brunswick after the Second World War, and the Second World War ends in 1945, so post-1945, one of the characteristics of forestry in New Brunswick was the rise of government intervention in the forest economy. So prior to 1960, except for a few very specific instances like transfer of Crown land licenses or leases that Bill was mentioning to the pulp and paper companies in the 1920s, or controlled production during the Second World War, the New Brunswick government was more than happy, by and large, to stay out a lot of questions of Crown forest management. And what this meant and what this translated into was minimal Crown forest management regulations and most decisions about forest management being left to the Crown land leasees. And we should mention that after the Second World War, that this namely meant the pulp and paper companies. By the 1950s, they would have had control upwards of 90% of Crown lands in the province. Now, while that might be the case, that there was sort of this sort of standoff approach to a large degree by the New Brunswick government, things really changed in the 1960s. And this agent for change was the famous Louis Robichaud. Now, Robichaud and his cohort were part of a new generation of politicians who were elected in the decades after the Second World War, who strongly believed in the power of government to improve citizens' lives, so that government had the power to affect serious change in people's lives on a day-to-day basis even. Now, the Robichaud administration in office from about 1960 to 1970 was particularly interested in the social and economic modernization of New Brunswick. So for them, various aspects of New Brunswick society and its economy were so-called backwards, needed to be modernized, needed to be made modern or brought into the second half of the 20th century, get rid of the vestiges perhaps of the 19th century. Perhaps the most famous example of this was the Robichaud administration's implementation of the program of equal opportunity. And this was supposedly about providing fairly equal level of government services across the province, so that it would supposedly wouldn't matter if you lived in wealthier southern counties or less well-off northern ones. And during this period when the Robichaud administration was pursuing this modernizing agenda, the federal government, the Canadian government, was also intervening more in economic matters. And we see this manifest itself through a whole series, a whole alphabet soup of regional economic development programs funded in part with the provinces throughout the 1960s. And for a lot of less well-off provinces like New Brunswick, this funding was very important and provided a lot of the funding needed to implement a lot of various social programs, reform programs that we'd see in places like Quebec, etc. Now, in New Brunswick, the New Brunswick government relied on a lot of its funding to implement its own modernizing programs. Now, for much of rural New Brunswick and for many northern urban centers, this vehicle for modernization identified by policymakers at the provincial level was the forestry sector. And this would be similar to the way in which fishing was identified as sort of the main vehicle in Newfoundland. It was seen as the main and sometimes only option for economic growth in various rural areas. Now, central to Robichaud's modernizing plans in rural New Brunswick and northern urban centers was the pulp and paper industry. And there was this real view as this was the part of the sector with the most long-term economic potential. Now, up into the 1960s, there was only a few major companies, maybe a half a dozen mills in the province, and lots of crown lands not being fully utilized, as Bill was telling us earlier. So the Robichaud administration, in order to sort of spur along this modernizing of rural New Brunswick that they were interested in, they implemented something that they called full utilization. And what this full utilization meant was trying to get the full potential out of the crown lands for the benefit of New Brunswick citizens, for the benefit of rural people, for the people who are living in these northern urban centers. This manifested itself in various ways. There was a reorganization of crown land leases or licenses. So if you had, say, international paper that was up in the northern part of the province, they might have had thousands of square kilometers of crown land down towards the Miramichi that would seem to be sitting idle for a long time on end, not using them. So there was this whole idea that we need to perhaps have the crown lands sort of beside the mills or closer to the mills that might actually use them. Part of this reorganization, there was a movement organized through the Robichaud government of crown land leases and through various parts of the province. This freed up crown land allotments in certain areas, which was used to attract other pulp and paper mills. They were also pushing for better integration with other wood-using industries like the sawmilling sector, etc. So there's sort of a larger push for full utilization of the crown lands with pulp and paper still at the center of it all. And what's guiding a lot of this is something that's been referred to as growth pull theory. I like to think of growth pull theory as kind of like the movie Field of Dreams, where they sort of thought of it in terms of if you build it, they will come. And the sort of the thinking is that if we can attract large mills to certain places in the province, this will lead to a whole series of economic spin-offs that will trickle out into the surrounding areas. So if we could just get these, modern 20th century exciting new mills into these parts of the province, they will have these sorts of spin-off effects to all around the surrounding countryside. In some ways, it was successful. The 1960s, in many ways, could be thought of as maybe a golden age of pulp and paper in New Brunswick. There were 4 new mills were attracted to the province in the 1960s, so that by 1970 there were about 10 companies and 11 pulp and paper mills in various portions throughout the province, particularly in the north. Perhaps the best example of this, sort of trying to attract some of the new mills to the province, was the mill in Nacowick, built in the late 1960s. And this was part of the larger Nacowick federal, provincial, regional economic development scheme in the later part of the 1960s and early 70s. And this involved building the Nacowick hydroelectric dam to provide cheap power to attract industry. It's about building the planned town site of Nacowick for those who are moved out of the way so the dam can be built. It's about building tourism infrastructure. Think of Nacowick Provincial Park, King's Landing, to provide jobs. But a major component was also attracting the company Parsons and Whitmore to build the massive pulp and paper mill in Nacowick. But this came at a cost. The feds in the province had to spend over $21 million directly and indirectly on the mill's development. And the New Brunswick government also had to act as a guarantor on more than $40 million in loans. So all of this, that trying to attract these new pulp and paper mills. And also along with this, as we've been talking about how the crown lands kind of go hand in hand, of course, with the development of forestry in the province, they're pushing for this more efficient use of land in the crown forests. They're trying to push the pulp and paper companies to do more with what they've got. As Bill mentioned earlier, there was the companies were more than willing to kind of let these lands just lay fallow and not use them to their full potential, if you will, just use them for the economic benefit. So what the Robichaud government was interested is sort of more large-scale industrial forest management that would help fuel the development of these mills in which they were trying to attract and have established in the province. The sorts of things they're interested in was clear cutting, tree planting, more highly efficient harvesting systems, cutting down on a lot of the waste that we've been talking about at various points, increased usage of hardwoods. That was sort of part of the thinking behind the Nacowick mill, that it could be greater use of hardwoods that were in the St. John River Valley. And to a large degree, the pulp and paper companies were unwilling to enact a lot of these changes and these sorts of programs on crown lands. They were quite willing to do this sort of stuff on private lands of their own. Fraser Companies was experimenting going back to the 1930s. Irving, for example, had their own nursery going back to the late 1950s. So there was, it's not as if they didn't know how to do it, but they just didn't necessarily want to implement these sorts of policies and practices on crown lands. And I would also say too, that when we're thinking about the crown lands, this is probably something that is obvious to many people who are in the audience today, but crown forests are more than just trees. We're talking about trees a lot here maybe today, but I just want to point out that they're more than trees. We also have to keep in mind that when we think of modern forestry, large scale and intensive, say, industrial forest management, it's more than about just cutting down trees. There's a whole system of inputs and externalities or consequences that support industrial forestry on this large scale. An example of an input that arose during this sort of expansion of the industry in the 50s and 60s was New Brunswick spruce budworm spraying program, for example, which was underway in one form or another from the early 1950s until late 80s, early 90s. From 1952 to 1968, more than 65 million liters of DDT mixture was sprayed over the forests of New Brunswick to help try to protect the forests from the spruce budworm. The spruce budworm eats the same trees that the pulp and paper industry likes to use. DDT is a solid, it's a powder, and it floats on water, so you need an emulsifier, something to capture it and help it float within the water, let it be mixed in. And the emulsifier that they used during much of this time was burnt oil. So a lot of this DDT oil water mixture was sprayed over the forests and had untold environmental consequences. People who did the work would tell you that, well, we saved the trees, and as a result, there's still forests here for us to work with. But I think we also need to point out that DDT had huge effect on salmon, birds, etc. The loss of eagles, and even recent scientific work that I think some people might have seen on in the CBC and elsewhere, where DDT in lake cores up in northern New Brunswick, there's still DDT is still there. An example of the externality would be the effluents from pulp and paper mills. As the Industrial Inquiry Commission on the Pulp and Paper Industry in New Brunswick noted in the early 1970s, throughout the province's history, quote, pulp and paper mills have been built and encouraged by all elements in the community seeking jobs, profits, and the prosperity which has traditionally been associated with this industry. No thought was given to the effect upon the environment, and quote, communities learned to live with the characteristic odors, and rivers appeared to be inexhaustible resources. So there was, it was not as if people weren't aware that something was happening, but a lot of people were willing to put up with the consequences of the influence, for the sake of local economic growth. And really effective regulatory practices were not put in place until the mid 1970s. And as we know, they weren't fully effective because there's still effluent issues in the 90s, et cetera. So it's also important to keep in mind all these inputs and externalities that go along with sort of this large scale industrial forestry that we see in the second half of the 20th century. Now, as mentioned repeatedly, it's not as if it's just industry and government. There are also lots of other players in New Brunswick's forestry sector. And by the late 1960s, these other forest users and the user groups were increasingly upset about the ways in which the sector revolved more and more around pulp and paper. And if you recall, as I mentioned earlier, there was all these inquiries and commissions and task forces and such, places where they could vocalize their concerns to the government. And we can still see a lot of their testimonies and concerns right up until the present day. So great sources of information. Sawmills, for example, especially smaller ones, ever since the 1930s and the arrival and the sort of the domination of pulp and paper, had repeatedly made the province aware that they had a hard time accessing wood on Crown lands. And they repeatedly blamed the level of control, almost near total control, exercised by the pulp and paper companies. So there was concern that if there was even more pulp and paper in the province, and even more control exerted over Crown lands, that perhaps they would have a hard time gaining access to wood. Woodlot owners, going back to the late 50s, early 60s, always maintained that pulp and paper companies would use control over Crown lands during negotiations over pulpwood prices and keep those pulpwood prices artificially low. If the pulp and paper companies didn't want to negotiate with the marketing boards, they could simply just find the wood on the Crown lands. Woods workers had always maintained that wages were too low. They unionized in the 1960s to try to get better pay, better benefits, better work situation. By the 1970s, pulp and paper companies were increasingly mechanizing woods operations. Woods workers were losing their jobs to large machines that could do the work of 20 men. And we see numerous incidents in the 1970s and the early 1980s of woods workers destroying all-in-one large harvesters in places like the Miramichi up north, etc., upset that these large machines were being used by companies on Crown lands to cut wood, instead thinking that these Crown lands should be used for the benefit of New Brunswick workers. Environmentalists and conservationists were initially most concerned about the aforementioned inputs and externalities that I was talking about. For example, spruce budworm spraying and the mill effluents. But getting into the later 70s, there was more attention paid to forest management. And we see that getting into the 80s and the 90s with debates over clear cutting, et cetera. Indigenous peoples had always been accessing Crown forests and private lands for traditional practices, but really never consulted by the province on any of this perhaps should be played out. The province was more than willing to let this be a federal jurisdiction or a federal affair during that period. It's not until later into the 90s when they're forced through court action to actually engage with Indigenous people, and not really perhaps. So all of this just to kind of point out that it's not as if there hasn't been other people and other forest user groups providing other models, other visions, other ideas of how Crown forests should be used. Would they have worked, any of them? Some of them might have, maybe not. But yeah, the point is that it's not as if it was always just inevitable or one way forward at all time. All right, I'm going to try to wrap up in the next 5 or so minutes here. Now, in the early 1970s, by the early 1970s, we see a major downturn in the forest industries. And we see a wave of layoffs in the northern mills in 1971. And it was really, you're losing 1,000 or 2,000 mill jobs within the period of months. And it really delivered this economic shock to the province. And the New Brunswick government, out of that, paid more attention to some of the other ideas that were out there, not just this sort of centralizing of the important central importance of pulp and paper to a lot of their plans they had in the 60s and 70s. So there was potential there for trying out other models, if you will. In the early 1970s, Bathurst Power and Paper gave up their Crown land lease in northeastern New Brunswick because of the downturn in the industry, and that represented about 1/7 of total Crown lands. And with that, the New Brunswick government set up something called the New Brunswick Forest Authority, and it was an experiment with what they referred to as system of guaranteed volume. And it was an experiment that they were going to run for about 5 years. And if this experiment of guaranteed volume worked, province was going to revoke all Crown land licenses and leases in the province and set up a Crown corporation to cut all wood and then just give the wood to the various mills that needed it, be it pulp and paper, be it saw, etc., and based on what they thought they might need for the coming year. And within this as well, they were also experimenting on a grand scale with a lot of this, sort of intensive industrial forest management that the pulp and paper companies had not been too eager to implement on Crown lands. I'm not going to get into it, but it failed for a variety of reasons by 1978. The wood up there wasn't great, etc. But what's important to note here that it appears to have demonstrated to the pulp and paper companies that by this point in the 70s, there was a moment where the government was willing to go to a certain length, and it's in part because there was a number of federal dollars that were coming in that gave the province a little more financial freedom, etc. And it also seemed to, kind of warned the pulp and paper companies that they could lose access to all Crown lands. It was a possibility. So it seemed to have pushed the pulp and paper companies into a position where they were more willing to work with the province to work out a new system of industrial forest management like the New Brunswick government had been wanting for a while. And this, as we know, leads up into 1980 to the passage of the Crown Lands and Forest Act. And this Crown Lands and Forest Act establishes 10 licenses. The different users are paying to access the forests, supposed to assume the cost of much of the management, etc. Now, of course, there are issues that arise with the Crown Lands and Forest Act. That's why a lot of us are here today, I'm sure. Forms the backbone of the whole system that's sort of now in place. There's been tweaks to it here and there, but a lot of it in the sort of the heart, the ethos behind it remains, I would say. And to a large degree, if there had been decent provisions in there from the beginning, a lot of those have been ignored over the years, and they've been allowed to, the different licensees have been allowed to get away with that. And if there had been elements within the Crown Lands and Forest Act that had also maybe been a decent provision, a lot of those have been removed as well, or certain ones of them have. I'm thinking here, for example, of the McKenna government removing a component of the Crown Lands and Forest Act in the early 1990s, in which companies had to negotiate with woodlot marketing boards before turning to the Crown forests. Now, this really enshrined and put in place this larger scale industrial forest management that the New Brunswick government was interested in, and it put in legislation almost put at the heart of New Brunswick's forestry sector, really sealed the deal as far as pulp and paper was concerned and being around. But there have been major issues with pulp and paper assuming the central role of the New Brunswick forest economy. There's been cyclical downturns to the industry about every decade or so, starting in the early 1960s, early 70s, as I mentioned earlier, 80s, early 90s, early 2000s, 2008. And because of the centrality which the pulp and paper industry has been given, there's been concern then if they disappear, will come after it. There's a bit of lack of imagination, maybe even, if you will. Because of that, the New Brunswick government and the federal government at times have stepped in every time since the early 1970s that there's one of these major downturns with massive amounts of bailout money for the pulp and paper industry. And has really kept it afloat to a large degree in the province. A good example of this would be in 2000, as the downturn in 2004, 2005, the Bernard Lord government announced a $250 million aid package for the pulp and paper industry. And we can look at all kinds of various sorts of financial packages and financial incentives over the years. And it can perhaps get to the hundreds of millions, and I don't know if we'd say billions or not, but it gets up there. And this is, when we think of the sort of economic situation which New Brunswick finds it in, it's not exactly the richest province in the world, that can be problematic. I'll turn it now back to Bill.
Thanks, Mark. I'm going to talk a little bit about the 21st century and what I call winning the race to the bottom. The 21st century, especially the first decade, was quite tumultuous for the forest industries. But the end result was that J.D. Irving and other companies in New Brunswick won this race to the bottom. There were a number of different problems that were behind the closing of pulp and paper mills in New Brunswick, but also Maine, Nova Scotia, the province of Quebec, and Ontario. They were one after 2000, the rising Canadian dollar against the American dollar. Each increment meant something to forest companies in Canada selling their products in the United States. There was a really remarkable drop in per capita paper consumption in the first decade of the 21st century. It has to do with the death of newspapers, online news, and a bunch of other factors related to computers. So the drop in per capita consumption of paper between 2004 and 2008 was 25%. Now, if you think about it, that's a short period to lose a full quarter of your market. Average per capita consumption of newsprint went down 50%. So you can really see in that period that the news paper industry is dying a quick and painful death. So there's two factors. The collapse of the U.S. housing market in 2008 was quite dramatic in terms of, low-end, marketing low-end value-added products such as 2x4s, which is a major industry in New Brunswick, of course. Now that's turned around, but it will go bust again because we're in another real estate bubble. The migration of low-end value-added products to China and South America was also a hardship on the Eastern Canadian pulp and paper industry. I was reading today, around 2010, one executive from Ontario said that copier paper, the basic copier paper, could be produced in Brazil and shipped to Toronto and sold cheaper than copier paper made in Ontario. So you can see where these migrations, which are characteristic of all resource-based industries. I mean, we tend to divide resource-based industries between non-renewable and renewable. Mining, obviously, there's understandably binning that the amount that you can mine in any given location is finite. Generally, fisheries and forestry are considered renewable resources, but they're not really. they tend to have the same life cycles as non-renewable resource industries. So they, there is generally migration at some point where those those factors that brought the industry there. Here it was hydropower and vast untapped forests become a liability. So you add up everything that's happening with lax labor laws, labor costs, higher growth rates in these developing countries, and you get basically an industry which is no longer competitive in world markets, and not competitive except for those companies in places like New Brunswick that can depend upon a high level of public support. So they need to be propped up. And I think this is a lesson that we'll learn again in a few years when the real estate bubble bursts. And just a few examples from our favorites, JDI, that speak to this kind of preference that they're given in terms of public support. JDI actually produces power, and it sells its power, if it has excess, to NB Power for more money than it buys power from NB Power. So you can see, how do you get to that kind of a perverse kind of business arrangement in a supposedly democratic society? In 2014, to give a second example, JDI was given a quote guarantee of a certain volume of wood from the Crown lands for decades. It's really the fruition of a 150-year dream of forest entrepreneurs to make Crown land the approximate equivalent of private land. So it's even better than private land in a sense, because having a guarantee of a certain amount of wood allows you to better socialize the risks of operating and privatize the profit. They're also been given enhanced clear-cutting rights beyond what people in DNR thought was sustainable. So I guess the point I would make is, for all the propaganda coming out of their silly developing world style propaganda wing, what J.D. Irving does and what other pulp and paper companies do in New Brunswick is much more like serial strip mining than it is forestry. They don't actually care that much about the forestry beyond those few species on which they can turn a profit. So all the propaganda to the contrary, that's what it boils down to, and that's considered good corporate management. It's not some kind of a conspiracy. So that's sort of the situation we're in now. Let's see what else I have here. One thing you can count on with the forest industries is that they only ever want one thing from the people in New Brunswick, and that is more of everything. So right now, they're very quiet. They refuse to comment on the royalty issue and deferred that to the provincial government. But you know that as soon as the market goes down, the hand will automatically go out again. So they're going to continue, I think, for the foreseeable future, of winning the race to the bottom. And we, the people of New Brunswick, will have to be satisfied with the privilege of wiping ourselves with our own tax dollars. So that's really what I have to say today. And on the meeting with government and the forest industries, my question really is an open one, but you can imagine what my response is. How much can we expect from a JDI executive who had no problem with removing a $25 million tax benefit to Indigenous communities? But well, apparently he didn't get the memo about truth or reconciliation. So they've obfuscated on the issue of Crown lands. I think out of that, maybe we'll get a few crumbs to let their propaganda machine make some hay. And as I said, I'll let others speak to the spraying problem, and that's really all I have to say.
Well, thank you, Bill and Mark. You provided lots of history that I was not aware of, and history that I forgot that's so important to remind ourselves about. So now we're going to go to Lois Corbett, who is the Executive Director of the Conservation Council, and I'm going to share Lois's slides. I get those up.
Thanks, Mark and Bill, for that. I always learn a lot more when I listen to you guys. Thanks, Tracy, for organizing all of us and the great peeps on the call. Thank you for all the work you've done, whether you've made movies or written letters or stood in protest or wrote books. I'm thinking of all the authors on this call. It's fantastic about the crisis in our Crown Lands forest. Look, I'm gonna do a really short history of the past couple of years and where the heck did this standing committee of the legislature come from, and why are they talking about glyphosate? So let's just go to the next slide there, Trace. This is a poll that we did in time for the last provincial election, just to give you a sense of where the people are. We did this in cooperation with the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, New Brunswick chapter, and the Atlantic Salmon Federation. But you can see where it's a big, long poll. You can read all the details, but you can see where New Brunswickers support much more action on protected areas, are mostly concerned about clear cutting and spraying in their forests. And they say, an overwhelming majority of them say they don't want spraying in the forest at all. Next slide there. In 2018 election, the Progressive Conservative Party platform, 18 pages long, on page 18, the party made a political commitment to review the Crown Lands and Forests Act. And I'm holding them to that promise because they haven't retracted it yet. Don't know what will happen the next couple of years. We're not seeing any major change. As a result of between the 2018 election, there was a few months there, remember, where we weren't quite sure who was the premier in that election. But when Blaine Higgs was officially called to be the premier, he gave his first throne speech, and he committed in that throne speech to appoint a science advisor to the Legislative Assembly who would deal with such issues as the spraying of herbicides in the Crown Forest and climate change. That morphed from that commitment in that particular throne speech into a committee of the legislature that was going to deal with spraying in the Crown Forest and Crown Forest management. It morphed again, I think primarily because some ministers in the minority government wanted to participate in the committee membership themselves into not a select committee, but a standing committee of the legislature. And for the first time, I think, I'll have to defer back to other historians, first time you see a standing committee of the New Brunswick legislature with actual ministers of the Crown sitting on the committee. Usually it's members of the legislature who aren't cabinet ministers, because that's where government ministers and departments are held to account. Think of the Public Accounts Committee. So they this committee first started to hold hearings in the winter of 2020, and they were just getting around to hearing from people like me and outside agents of change. And COVID hit, so the standing committee was suspended, and then I'm going to zoom forward right up to the last year's election. After the election, the Conservatives won a very small majority, as you know, and they reconstituted the standing committee and changed the name and tweaked its terms of reference, called it the Standing Committee on Climate Change and Environmental Stewardship, which I just call the Everything in the Kitchen Sink Committee, to be frank. And they expanded their examination of glyphosate away from Crown Forest to include all pesticides, all herbicides, all uses everywhere. Don't know if that includes your puppy's or your dog's tick collar or not, but it's tactic. Not the first time I've seen that tactic. It's not us, it's them. It's not us, it's your lawns. It's not us, it's ag. And so that's where we stand now. You can see on this map the members of the standing committee. And this is important to all of you on the call, but especially for any of you cats who live in these ridings. We need to, let's say you're from the St. Croix riding, you need to write a letter as soon as you can to Kathy Baucus, the new MLA, PC member of the standing committee. If you live in Carleton, Woodstock area, or Carleton, Victoria, Margaret Johnson's number 46, Bill Hogan is 45. And then you'll see the Liberal members of the committee up here in the north, Francine Landry, Eric Mallier, and then down to Shediac, Jacques Leblanc. See Megan Mitten down there in the corner from the Green Party, Mike Holland, Michelle Conroy from the Miramichi. She's a member from the People's Alliance of New Brunswick. And then the council, the cabinet ministers, like I mentioned, Margaret Johnson, Mike Holland, and Gary Crossman, Minister of the Environment. Next slide, please. I know that Minister Holland and no doubt other ministers and members of that party will try to get a few of the experts and citizens that they've invited to depute between June the 22nd and June the 25th to comment on all glyphosate and all glyphosate use, including use in agriculture and on lawn care. But our presentation is going to focus almost entirely on spraying in the Crown Forest. This is last year's spray map, as we produce these every year at the Conservation Council. The 2021 spray map aren't out yet. The spraying usually starts in August and September in New Brunswick. Go ahead, Trace. This is because I'm kind of squishing 2 years of history, but thank goodness not 200 years of history like Bill and Mark do for us so well. The call to action is to write or call your MLA. You can see that when you do that, you won't be alone. These are letters that the Conservation Council has collected over the past 4 years. And we mapped them to see where, if there were any gaps in communities. You can see pretty well covered area. At the end of the day, it's spraying and large-scale clear cutting that's animating citizens and engaging citizens to write these types of letters. So the call to action, I'll repeat that. Next slide, Trace. It's just write, if you can, please write to your MLA, call them if you want. Some of you, particularly those in the Fredericton South riding, probably don't really need to do that. Dave Kuhn is going to sub in for Megan on the committee for the June sessions. because Megan's going to have her baby, which is great news too. But you probably don't need to write that particular MLA, but I know that he doesn't mind getting them. So even if you have written before, please take that easy action. Go right to the Conservation Council of New Brunswick's website. It's on our front page. Take action, click on that, and you'll get right to the letter writing tool. Now, because you folks on the call have so much experience, either in the woods, in your particular watershed, as academics, as writers, you might want to write quite a bit more than the engagement letter writing kit that we have on our website. But I want you to go to that site. You can change the content, you can add things, but when you go through that website, we're able to track which MLA is getting it. And that means that all of the folks that are working on this issue can make sure that they know that yes, Francine Landry did get letters, and yes, Michelle Conroy did get letters. Big shout out to Stop Spraying in New Brunswick. Sign their petition if you haven't already. Get a sign. They're new, hot off the shelf this year, last year, are their license plates. Those are great. And I'm working quite a bit with Caroline from Stop Spraying NB and with others, trying to work out our strategy for the June sessions and follow up for that. The June sessions were by invite only to experts in quotation marks. And the committee decided that they would restrict it to people from New Brunswick. They did invite written submissions from other experts in toxicology, in forestry. They've invited comment from the Pest Management Regulatory Agency, for example, in Ottawa. And those written submissions are starting to trickle in. They will eventually be available on the Legislative Committee's website, but we're also collecting as many as we can right now. So if anyone would like to see any of those papers, just pop me an email at the Conservation Council and I'll see what I can get to you. And for those of you who are on social media, particularly Facebook, the hint is just share, share, share. So whenever you see something that you like about what's happening at the standing committee today, or comments or photos of clear cuts, and my goodness, New Brunswickers have a lot of those, please share. I know we're a lot of likers, but we really want you to also share, so that expands your post to your friends and families and groups on Facebook that you participate in. So that's sort of where the heck did this select committee come from. If you would have asked me when there was a minority government, our chances of moving progress forward on both Crown Forest Act changes and perhaps a drawdown, maybe a 5-year phase out for spraying in the Crown Forest, I would say we had a pretty good shot. Now that the majority on the committee and in the House is a progressive conservative majority, I think the chances are slim, but there's a good, nice, pretty well-rounded list of experts coming into the committee that will present pretty strong arguments for both reform of the Crown Forest Act with respect to protecting ecosystems and management for other values rather than just the licensee values. And secondly, on the human health impact and concerns, I think that it's only 4 days in time. It's 4 days in time where we have the revolution for how we manage and protect our forests in New Brunswick. Absolutely not. But we have to take these opportunities that are afforded to us. We have to take the action we can. Thanks, Tracy.
Thank you, Lois.